Welcome to today's MOOC lecture on the topic, Can Human Rights be Universal? And the issue of cultural relativism. So from the very title of this topic, you can understand that we are mainly going to enter into a debate in this topic between the universalists and the cultural relativists regarding the nature of human rights. I have planned today's lecture into three broad sections. In the first section, we will look at the meaning of human rights, to be more specific, universal human rights. In the second section, we will deal with the concept and arguments of cultural relativism or cultural relativists. And in the third and final section, we will enter into the debate between the universalists and the cultural relativists regarding the nature of human rights. Now, to begin with, the concept of right is one of the core concepts in political theory and political philosophy. Political philosophers and political theorists since long have dealt with the concept of right at various contexts of social and political development. But one thing is in common between or among their dealing with the concept of right, that is the rights. By dealing with rights, they have mainly focused on the rights of the individual in the society. How the individuals can gain their rights, what is the role of the state in protecting their rights, the concept of citizenship, which is closely related with the concept of right, the rights enjoyed by the citizens in a democratic society. So all these have been closely associated with the concept of right. Now, the concept of human rights was largely influenced among many streams of thoughts, and one of the major concept was the concept of natural rights as propounded by the famous English political philosopher and liberal John Locke. John Locke's concept of natural law or natural rights that has largely influenced the development of the concept of human rights in the modern period. Now, this concept of human rights is a comparatively new one in the discourse of political science or, say, global politics, international politics. It became significant and important only after the Second World War, when the United Nations was established and the miseries of the Second World War, the violation of the rights of the individual, their loss of property, Holocaust, all this led to a thinking among the scholars, academicians, policymakers about the necessity of protecting the rights of the individual, the basic rights of the individual throughout the world. And in the initiative of the United Nations after the Second World War, the United Nations General Assembly on December 10, 1948, they enacted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is regarded as a major milestone in the development of the issue of rights in human society. Now, this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it has total 32 articles, Article 1 to Article 32, I will now quote certain portions from the first three articles, Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3, because that will give us an idea of what exactly the universalism of human rights means, what was meant by the framers of this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So now I quote the portions of three articles. First, Article 1 of UDHR, that is Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Quote, Article 1 states, quote, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, unquote. Article 2, quote, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration, without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Full stop, unquote. Article 3, quote, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Full stop, unquote. Now these three articles, it is revealed, clearly mentions the core idea of this declaration, that is, human rights are universal in nature. These rights are enjoyed by all the human beings in all parts of the world, in each and every country, without any distinctions on the basis of the various factors we have just mentioned, which Article 2 elaborates, which we have quoted just now. And Article 3, it is evident when it speaks of that everybody, every human being should have the right to life, liberty, and security of person. It is clearly an example of influence of John Locke, which I was mentioning earlier. John Locke's theory of natural rights also mentioned of three rights: life, liberty, and estate. So this is how the tradition of natural rights influenced the emergence and development of the concept of human rights in the 20th century, particularly after the Second World War. So in these three articles and also in the later articles of the document lies the universality of the human rights, which focuses on the factor that human beings possess these rights, all kinds of rights, only because they are human beings. So that is the only condition to be fulfilled. To enjoy these rights, a person should be a human being, not a non-human or God. They do not possess these rights. Only the human beings possess these rights. And all other considerations, race, gender, class, caste, economic status, social status, political status, all are irrelevant, because irrespective of all this, each and every individual in each and every corner of the globe enjoy these rights. So this is what is meant by the universality of the human rights. And the universalists, they focus or emphasize basically on this part or this notion of the nature of the human rights. And at the same time, they emphasize that all these rights are inalienable. That means these rights cannot be taken out from the individuals by the state or any other authority on any consideration. Now, since the inception of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the late 1940s till today, the concept of human rights has developed in a number of dimensions and it has acquired different kinds of meaning, which we usually divide into certain generations. Normally we speak of 4 generations of human rights. Starting from the 1950s, the rights which were emphasized upon were mainly the civil and political rights of the individuals. Those were the first generation of human rights. Say, for example, right to freedom of speech, right to free association, right not to get arrested by the police without any cause, etc., etc., right to vote. Now, this was the first generation of human rights. The second generation of human rights, they focused on social and economic rights. Say, for example, the right to work, right to education, right to health facilities, housing facilities, right to leisure, so on and so forth. The third generation of human rights, they focused on rights of groups and communities more than the rights of individual per se. Say, for example, it focused on the rights of the minorities, various kinds of minorities, and so on. And lastly, in which phase we are passing through now at present day, which is called the fourth generation of human rights, that started focusing on the issues which were earlier not within the compass of the discourse on human rights. Say, for example, environmental rights, gender rights, rights of the differently abled persons, rights of the LGBT queer, etc., etc. So this is how, over the period, over the centuries, the concept of human rights has developed and gained newer and newer meanings. Now, this issue of human rights has been in debate and discourse for the very fact that on one side we have noticed attempts to protect the human rights, and on the other side there have been innumerable instances of violation of human rights throughout the world at different corners of the globe. So naturally, the issue of the protection of the human rights has led to the emergence of the debate between the universalists and the cultural relativists, which we mentioned at the beginning of today's lecture. Now, in the second part, we will focus on what or how the universalists look at the issue of human rights, and then how the cultural relativists look at the issue of human rights. The universalists believe that the same human rights should apply to everyone, regardless of their culture or background. Wherever they reside, whichever society they come from, whichever nation they belong to, all the human beings in the world, they should enjoy the same kind of rights, which are designated as human rights. Say, for example, they argue that the rights to equal protection by law, physical security, free speech, freedom of religion, free association, etc., etc., must be the same everywhere throughout the world. So this is the core of the concept of universalism. And this concept of universalism is based on 3 fundamental jurisprudential theories. So these 3 core jurisprudential theories on which this universalism of human rights is based are: number 1, the theory of natural law; Second, the theory of rationalism. And third, the theory of positivism. And on the basis of these three, the universalists, they argue, the core argument of them is that the human rights are extra-cultural. They are not and they should not be determined by a particular culture. And that is the core of universalism or universality. Now, as against this, the other school, that is the cultural relativists or cultural relativism, they believe that human rights should always take into account of cultural differences between individuals, between human beings, between different societies, between different nations. Because they argue, they believe that culture varies from society to society, from nation to nation. Therefore, the cultural relativism states that values are defined by local culture as opposed to global ideology. That means an individual, his beliefs, his emotions, his opinions, his ideas, his value system, everything is determined by, is molded by the culture he or she belongs to. The individual is basically a social animal. That means it is the society's culture, which molds, shapes his norms, his or her values, his or her behavior, his or her opinion, everything. So the individual human being is a cultural being. So it is the culture which determines their concepts of rights, freedom, liberty, everything. So, which rights will be emphasized upon, which rights will not be so much emphasized upon, that is based on the particular culture, and that differs from culture to culture. So this is one of the basic argument of the cultural relativists as against the universalists. And cultural relativists also argue that this very notion of human rights was basically an Western construct. It was developed by the Western nations in a particular context. So the cultural relativists argue that the very idea of human rights, that was a Western construct that was developed by the Western nations, the Western political thinkers and philosophers, based on Western morality, and therefore those cannot be and should not be imposed upon the human beings in the non-Western world. Because the non-Western societies, the non-Western nations, they have different histories, different cultures, different morality, and different levels of development. So, cultural relativism views that moral or ethical systems that vary from culture to culture, and all are equally valid in the context of that particular culture. We cannot say that this is the best culture and another culture we cannot identify as an worse one. We cannot say that. Each and every culture has its own uniqueness, and we should focus on that uniqueness. So let us look at some examples of cultural relativism that will make the thing, I suppose, more lucid to you. So, some examples of cultural relativism. First, say for example, the diverse marriage systems that exist or operates in different societies and different cultures. The norms, the rituals which are associated with marriage, that is not the same in all the cultures, in all the countries, and among all the communities of people. Secondly, which differs a lot at different parts of the globe, is our food habit. Our food habit, our eating habit. If you go to Southeast Asian countries, you will find people there eating many insects, cockroaches, snakes, and so on. You can't stand that when you are from a different culture. But to them, it is very normal, it is very usual. So food habit, eating habit, that differs from culture to culture, from society to society. Another very glaring example is that hand holding in public of the same-sex people. Say in our country, in India, if two boys or two gentlemen, they are walking on the street in the public, holding their hands together. So nobody will interpret it as that they have a kind of a romantic relationship or sexual relationship. But you go to London or any other Western countries, there, walking in the public holding hands is regarded basically that the two persons have a romantic relationship between them. So this is another example. Next, the women's dress codes, which also differs from country to country, from society to society. Say, for example, the debates regarding burqas, hijabs, and all these. Child labor is another very important issue. Whether child labor should be accepted or not, whether it is moral or immoral, the argument varies from society to society, from culture to culture. Breastfeeding by the mother in the public. In some societies, that is accepted, in others, that is not accepted. So there are numerous such examples which prove, which reveal that the judgment of right or wrong, just or unjust, moral or immoral, is basically determined by a particular culture, and the people belonging to that culture, their belief, their behavior, their opinions are molded, shaped by that culture. So in some societies, what is regarded as a right of an individual or a person, in another society, that may not be regarded as a right or an entitlement of a human being. So that is why the cultural relativists, they argue that human rights are always culture specific. They cannot be universal in nature. Now, cultural relativism as a approach to look at the issue of human rights, that was first used in anthropology, in anthropological research to be specific, by a famous anthropologist, Franz Boas, in the first few decades of the 20th century. It was later popularized by his students, and then in the 70s onwards by other political thinkers and political philosophers. Boas, however, did not coin this particular term, cultural relativism. We find the first use of this term in Oxford English Dictionary in 1924 by another very famous philosopher and social theorist, Alian Locke, in 1924, and there we first found the use of this term, cultural relativism. Now, in response to the arguments of cultural relativists, the universalists argue that the ideas such as liberty, security, all these belong to all of us. They see the arguments of cultural relativists as attempts to justify oppression of minorities or defend harmful cultural practices. They argue that in fact this has happened and is happening at different parts of the world, where the state or those in power, they are suppressing the minorities, different kinds of minorities, with a plea that their culture does not promote this kind of activities. In fact, some scholars have also pointed out, citing the example of our own country, India, that even in the modern period, the practice of shoti was very much relevant and it was being practiced. So this was a kind of oppression, the universalists will argue. So the universalists argue that cultural relativists, in the name of relativism, they often take resort to these kinds of actions, which ultimately leads to the violation of human rights and not promotion and protection of human rights. Universalist further argues that the cultural relativist, they pick and choose which rights they are willing to give to the people and which not. It depends on their sweet will, and again, it amounts to a violation of the human rights. So these are the arguments and counter-arguments of the universalists and the cultural relativists regarding the nature of human rights. So it is clear that there is a tension between human rights as entirely universal and not subject to modifications due to culture on the one hand, versus human rights as affected by cultural demands of specific context on the other hand. So this is the core of the debate. This debate is ongoing, and this debate or tension or collision, whatever we say, between the idea of universal human rights as an objective truth and the cultural relativism of diverse communities throughout the world brings up all sorts of complicated arguments, say about arguments regarding imperialism and colonialism, objective versus subjective truth, ethnocentrism and xenophobia, and so on. But these are issues which need detailed discussions and analysis, which is not the scope of today's lecture. So we will conclude by saying that the debate between universalism and cultural relativism is an ongoing debate, and there are various issues and questions which are coming out of this debate. We cannot conclude by saying that this is the right approach or this is the wrong approach. In fact, we should consider these two approaches as complementary to one another rather than conflicting to one another. So this debate will go on, this will continue, and this will help us, we think, to understand the nature of human rights more deeply and more correctly in the future. With these words, we conclude this lecture. Thank you.